He laughed. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the pen scratching across the paper. Not the moment the ink dried. The part people never mention is the laugh. My husband Marcus sat across from me at our own dining room table, the table we bought together at an estate sale in our first year of marriage, the one with the water ring stain he swore he'd sand out and never did, and when that divorce paper landed in front of him, he didn't flinch. He didn't pause. He picked up the pen, signed his name with a looping, almost theatrical flourish, looked directly at me, and laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind that slips out when you don't know what else to do. This was a full laugh. Satisfied. Victorious. The laugh of a man who believes he has already won. And I sat there and watched it happen. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, this man I had loved for 11 years, this man I had built a life with, raised children with, buried my mother beside, and I let him laugh. Because here's what Marcus didn't know that day. He thought he was getting out. He thought he'd finally found the exit. What he didn't know, what no one at that table knew except me, was that the moment he signed that paper, he didn't escape anything. He stepped directly into everything. 24 hours later, Marcus could not stop crying. Not from grief. Not from regret. From something far worse than either of those things. But before we get to that, we have to go back. Because this story didn't start with a divorce. It didn't even start with a marriage. It started with a lie so perfectly constructed, so carefully maintained, so deeply embedded in the foundation of our life together that by the time I found it, by the time I finally understood what I was looking at, it had been growing for years. And the most terrifying part? I had helped build it. I had handed him the tools. I had believed every single word. So here's the question I need you to sit with right now, before we go any further. What would you do, what would you really do, if you discovered that the person you trusted most in the world had been using your love as a business strategy? Not just cheating. Not just lying. But engineering, deliberately, patiently, methodically engineering, your destruction, piece by piece, while kissing you goodnight and praying at church beside you on Sunday mornings. Because that's what happened to me. And when I found out, when the whole architecture finally came into view, I had a choice. I could fall apart. Or I could build something. I chose to build. And what I built, changed everything. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and say hello in the comments. I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Today's warm shout-out goes to Patricia Broussard from the United States, Wanda from South Africa, and Juliet from Jamaica. Thank you for being part of our family. Subscribe now and comment below so I can welcome you too. Stay with me. Because what happened next, no one was prepared for. Her name is Vivienne Cole. That's not the name she was born with, she took her grandmother's surname after the divorce, a quiet act of reclamation nobody noticed except her, but that's the name she carries now. Vivienne Cole. A name that belongs entirely to her. But when this story begins, she was Vivienne Hargrove. And the name Hargrove still makes her jaw tighten, even now, even after everything. Vivienne is 51 years old. She grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the youngest daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a man who ran an insurance agency for 30 years without once losing a client's trust. She studied business administration, graduated near the top of her class, and went on to build a regional logistics company from scratch in a market where most people told her a black woman had no business trying. She had built it anyway. By the time she married Marcus Hargrove, a charismatic real estate developer she met at a Chamber of Commerce mixer in Charlotte, she was already running a company with 16 employees and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 distribution contracts. She was not naive. She was not careless. She was not the kind of woman who missed things. Which is exactly why what happened to her is so important to understand. Because if it could happen to Vivienne, it could happen to anyone. Now, here is where I need you to pay close attention. Because this story has layers. And every layer is going to rewrite what you thought you knew about the one before it. Layer 1, Marcus Hargrove was not who he appeared to be on the day they met. But here's the first question I want you to hold: did he become that person slowly, over years of marriage? Or was he always that person, and the marriage was simply part of the design? That answer changes everything. Layer 2, the divorce papers that made Marcus laugh were not the papers Vivienne had originally filed. They were the second version. The first version, the one her attorney drafted 6 months earlier, Marcus never saw. And there's a reason for that. A very specific, very deliberate reason. What was in the first version that Vivienne chose to replace? Hold that. Layer 3, Vivienne knew something on the day Marcus signed that most people don't discover until it's too late. She knew exactly how much he stood to lose. She had known for 4 months. And she hadn't said a word. Why would a woman who was betrayed, who had every right to be furious, every reason to confront, choose silence? I'll tell you exactly why. But first we have to understand who Marcus Hargrove really was. Because you can't understand a strategy without understanding the threat. And Marcus Hargrove was a very specific kind of threat. The kind that smiles at you while he empties the room. Vivienne met Marcus on a Thursday evening in October, 12 years before the divorce. The mixer was at a hotel ballroom in uptown Charlotte, one of those events where everybody is working, even when they look like they're relaxing. Business cards changing hands over hors d'oeuvres. Conversations that start with, "What do you do?" and end with, "Let's schedule a call." Marcus walked in 40 minutes late, which was either inconsiderate or deliberate. Vivienne would later decide it was deliberate. He had a way of entering a room that made people look up, not because he was loud, but because he moved like a man who already knew where he was going and had already decided it was worth arriving. He found her at the bar, not immediately. He made his rounds first. She watched him work the room, the handshakes, the laughs, the easy confidence, and she thought, he's good at this. She didn't mean it as a compliment, not exactly. She meant it as an observation. The way you'd note that a car handles well. Useful information. When he finally came to stand beside her, he didn't open with a pitch. That's what surprised her. Most of the men at these events opened with what they needed you to know about them. Marcus opened with a question. What's the hardest part of building something, he asked, that people don't tell you about until you're already in it? Vivienne looked at him. She thought for a moment. Then she said, the loneliness. Nobody talks about the loneliness. He nodded slowly. Like he already knew. Yeah, he said. Yeah, that's exactly it. And right there in that small moment, was the first stone in the foundation of 11 years. She didn't know then that he had used that question before. That he had calibrated it. That he knew, with the precision of a man who had studied what made people trust him, exactly which kind of person responded to that opening, and what it meant about them when they did. She just thought, he understands something real. They talked for 2 hours. He was funny, not try-hard funny, genuinely funny, the kind of wit that catches you off guard. He was curious. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details from 20 minutes earlier and circled back to them. He made Vivienne feel like the most interesting person in the room. But here's what Vivienne didn't know yet, that feeling, that particular, specific warmth of being truly seen by someone, was the product. It was what Marcus Hargrove had learned to manufacture, because it was the most valuable thing he could offer. More valuable than charm. More valuable than good looks. More valuable than love. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. He proposed in her grandmother's garden, in Raleigh, on a Sunday afternoon. Her grandmother was 91 years old and still kept roses. He had driven down the night before and introduced himself to her grandmother before he asked Vivienne anything. He sat in the old woman's front room and drank sweet tea and answered her questions for an hour. Vivienne's grandmother, who trusted no one and had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her friends, told Vivienne afterward, he's a good man. I can tell. The wedding was small. 60 people. A church in Charlotte that Vivienne had attended her whole life. Her sisters stood beside her. Her father walked her down the aisle, and here is the detail that Vivienne still cannot think about without her chest tightening. Her father, who was not an emotional man, who had not cried at either of her sisters' weddings, cried at hers. He told her afterward, I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because you found someone worthy. Her father died 3 years into the marriage. He never knew what he had missed. The first years were good. Genuinely good. Vivienne has spent a lot of time examining this, making sure she isn't rewriting the past to match what she knows now, and her honest answer is, those years were real. The laughter was real. The Sunday mornings were real. The 2 children they had together, a son named Elijah and a daughter named Nadia, were made in love that felt real. But somewhere in year 4, something changed. It didn't announce itself. That's the thing about erosion, you don't feel it happening. You just look up one day and something that used to be solid is no longer there. Marcus started traveling more. Development projects in other markets, Atlanta, Nashville, Richmond. The explanations were always reasonable. The absences were always temporary. Vivienne was busy herself. She was managing a growing company, raising 2 young children, building a life. She didn't have time to interrogate every gap. But here's what she noticed: even if she couldn't name it yet, Marcus stopped being curious about her. Not dramatically. Not coldly. Just, the questions stopped coming. The follow-up questions. The remembering details and circling back. The thing that had made him feel like he saw her quietly disappeared, and what replaced it was a man who was present but not attentive. Warm but not invested. She told herself, this is what marriages become. This is normal. She told herself that for 3 years. But what she didn't know, what she had absolutely no way to know at the time, was that the curiosity had always been a tool. And once the tool had done its job, Marcus simply moved it to another project. The project had a name. Her name was Denise. And Denise was not the only one. But that's not where this story goes next. Because even the affair, as devastating as it would eventually prove to be, was not the center of what Marcus had built. The affair was a distraction. The real project was the company. Vivienne's company. It started with a spreadsheet. Vivienne had a habit she'd kept since her very first year in business. Every Sunday evening, she sat down with a cup of coffee and reviewed the week's financials. Not because she didn't trust her bookkeeper. Because she believed that anyone who runs a company and doesn't personally understand its money is a person who will eventually be surprised by it. This particular Sunday was in March. Elijah was at a friend's house. Nadia was asleep. Marcus was in Nashville, he'd said. A project meeting. Vivienne sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her coffee, and she opened the operational account summary. And something was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not obviously wrong. Just, a number that didn't sit right. A vendor payment that went to an account she didn't immediately recognize. It was small. $3,200. The kind of amount that gets lost in a busy week. She told herself it was probably nothing. An auto-renewal. A service fee she'd approved and forgotten. She made a note and closed the laptop. But she didn't sleep well that night. The next morning she called her bookkeeper, a meticulous woman named Gloria who had worked with Vivienne for 7 years. Gloria was quiet for a moment when Vivienne read her the account number. "I thought you approved that," Gloria said carefully. "Approved what?" Another pause. "The consulting arrangement. For Meridian Strategic Group." "It's been," Gloria went quiet again. "Vivienne. How far back do you want me to pull the records?" And there it was. The first crack. Vivienne pulled every record going back 14 months. What she found, spread across 17 months of transaction history, was a series of payments, consistent, patient, deliberate, flowing from her company's operational fund into a consulting entity she had never heard of, had never approved, and could not locate in any contract, agreement, or vendor record in her system. The total across those 17 months, $91,000. If you're still feeling what I'm feeling right now, comment "I'm still here." $91,000. Moving quietly out of a company she had built with her own hands, in amounts calibrated carefully to stay beneath the threshold that would trigger internal review. Someone who moved that money knew how her review thresholds worked. Someone who moved that money knew her business from the inside. Vivienne sat at her desk for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She did not call Marcus. She called her attorney. Her attorney was a woman named Carolyn Bates. Carolyn had represented Vivienne in contract disputes, in a near-miss acquisition 2 years ago, in the intellectual property case that had briefly threatened to take her biggest client. Carolyn was not a warm woman. She was a precise woman. She called things what they were, and she had exactly zero patience for softening difficult truths. When Vivienne laid out what she'd found, Carolyn listened without interrupting. Then she said, "I need 3 days. Don't move anything. Don't say anything to Marcus. Go about your week like nothing has changed." Vivienne said, "How am I supposed to do that?" Carolyn said, "The same way you built a company in a market that didn't want you. One careful step at a time." 3 days later, Carolyn called back. Meridian Strategic Group was a Delaware-registered LLC, incorporated 4 years ago. Its registered agent was a law firm. Its operating address was a mail forwarding service. Its sole member, buried 3 layers deep in a chain of entity ownership, behind 2 holding companies and a nominee structure that would have taken a casual searcher hours to untangle, was Marcus Hargrove. Vivienne's husband. The man who had kissed her goodbye that morning and told her he'd be home by 7. Carolyn read her the entity documentation over the phone, slowly and clearly, the way a doctor reads a diagnosis to a patient who needs to hear every word. Vivienne didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long?" Carolyn said, "Based on the incorporation date. He set this up 4 years ago. Before your last major contract renewal. Before your series of operational expansions. This was built in advance, Vivienne. It was not reactive. It was planned. For years. For years of Sunday morning coffee. For years of watching her work, watching her systems, watching her thresholds and her patterns and her trust. For years of gathering information and positioning himself to use it. For years of a man who had stopped being her husband and started being something else entirely. And Vivienne hadn't seen it. But here's what I want you to notice, because this is the part that matters most. She made a decision. A very specific, very quiet, very deliberate decision. She would not confront Marcus. Not yet. Not until she knew everything. Not until every piece was in place. Because Vivienne understood something that Marcus, in all his calculation, had fundamentally misread about her. She was not just a target. She was a builder. And builders don't swing before the foundation is ready. The investigator Carolyn recommended was named Douglas Webb. He was former forensic accounting, now private sector. He wore the same gray blazer every time Vivienne met with him, which she found oddly reassuring. He did not speculate. He only reported what he could document. He came back with 3 things that changed the shape of everything. The first, the consulting payments from Vivienne's company were not the only stream. Marcus had established 2 additional extraction routes, one through a real estate holding she'd co-signed 4 years ago that he had quietly transferred out of joint ownership through a series of micro-amendments she hadn't caught, and one through a travel and entertainment card he'd registered under the business tax ID without her knowledge. Total documented extraction over 4 years, $247,000. $247,000. Not borrowed. Not borrowed with intent to repay. Taken. Systematically, patiently, deliberately taken from a woman who trusted him with her life. The second finding, Denise was not the only affair. There were 2 others over the course of the marriage. One was brief. One was not. The non-brief one, a woman named Tamara, who worked in Marcus's Nashville office, had been ongoing for 2 years and involved Marcus funding a deposit on a condo using money from the joint travel card. He had used Vivienne's money to build a life with someone else. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. The third finding was this: Marcus had been in active conversations, documented, time-stamped, retrieved from a communications backup his attorney had carelessly CC'd on a shared account, with a business rival of Vivienne's named Raymond Solis. And those conversations contained the words, "Once the divorce goes through and the asset review is triggered, her contracts are vulnerable during the transition period. That's our window. 6 to 8 weeks. Hit the distribution clients directly." Marcus hadn't just been stealing from her. He had been building a coordinated strategy to dismantle her company during the divorce, using the chaos of asset division as cover to poach her client base and hand it to her direct competitor. He was going to take her money, her stability, her business, and walk away clean. And that's when everything changed. Vivienne sat in Carolyn's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November with 3 folders on the conference table in front of her. Douglas Webb's investigation. The financial documentation. The communications transcript. She had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. Carolyn sat across from her and waited. "What are my options?" Vivienne said. It wasn't a question. It was a checkpoint. Carolyn opened her own folder. Option 1, we file immediately. Civil fraud, fraudulent transfer of marital assets, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy with a third party, specifically Solis, to cause business harm. This is a strong case, Vivienne. This isn't divorce leverage. This is a criminal referral with civil teeth. Vivienne nodded. Option 2. Option 2, we file the divorce first, clean and simple, and we hold the civil case. We let him sign. We let him feel like it went his way. And then we move. Vivienne looked at the folder. She thought about Marcus's laugh, not the one that hadn't happened yet, but the one she already knew was coming. She had known her husband for 11 years. She knew how he performed victory. If we file the civil case first, she said slowly, he knows what we have. He lawyers up, he restructures, he moves the remaining assets. He's had 4 years of practice moving money. He's good at it. Yes, Carolyn said. But if he thinks the divorce is just a divorce, he'll sign fast. He'll want it clean. He believes you don't know about the money. His entire play depends on you not knowing. Vivienne was quiet. He's been underestimating me for 4 years, she said finally. Yes. Let him do it one more time. She chose option 2. She went home that evening and made dinner. She set the table. She put Nadia to bed and helped Elijah with a science project. When Marcus came in at 8:15, she looked up from the kitchen counter and said, "There's pasta on the stove." He said, "Thanks, babe." She went to bed at 10. She lay in the dark and thought about her father crying at her wedding. She thought about her grandmother's roses. She thought about $247,000. She slept 4 hours. And she started building. The next 4 months were the most disciplined of Vivienne's life. She divided her attention into 2 tracks. On track 1, the business. She began, quietly and without announcement, to lock down her client relationships in ways that would make them resistant to poaching. Personal meetings. Contract renewals with loyalty provisions. Quiet conversations with her 3 biggest clients in which she framed the conversations as routine business development check-ins, and in which she planted, gently but clearly, the idea that her company was entering a period of strengthening, not uncertainty. She was building a seawall before the storm arrived. Track 2 was the legal architecture. Carolyn worked with a forensic accountant to build the civil complaint from the ground up, every transaction mapped, every entity connection traced, every documentation point authenticated twice. It was 29 pages when it was finished. Carolyn told her it was the most thorough private financial fraud complaint she had built in 23 years of practice. Vivienne also made one additional move, the move that she did not tell even Carolyn about until it was done. She contacted 2 of Marcus's development partners directly. Not to accuse. Not to threaten. Simply to introduce herself, really introduce herself, the full professional version, the version Marcus had never thought to present, and to ask, in the measured tone of a woman conducting due diligence, a few clarifying questions about the structure of certain shared investments. What she learned from those conversations confirmed what Douglas Webb had suspected but couldn't fully document. Marcus had been representing himself to his development partners as the sole operator of at least one asset that was still, technically, jointly owned. He had been spending money that wasn't entirely his to spend. But here's what nobody realized: one of those partners, a quiet, methodical man named Gerald from Greensboro, had been watching Marcus for reasons that had nothing to do with Vivienne. Gerald called her back 3 days later. He said, "I think we should have a longer conversation." That conversation would become the second folder. Vivienne filed in February. Clean, simple, no fireworks. Equitable distribution. Straightforward language. The kind of filing that looks like a woman who simply wants out. A woman who is sad but reasonable. A woman who has accepted that the marriage is over and just wants to close the chapter with dignity. Marcus's attorney called Carolyn within 48 hours. His tone, Carolyn reported, was almost cheerful. He said Marcus is prepared to move quickly. He said Marcus wants this resolved cleanly. No prolonged proceedings. Clean break. Vivienne said, "Of course he does." She thought about the 6 to 8 week window Marcus had described to Raymond Solis. The transition period. The vulnerability. He needed the divorce done fast so the chaos could begin fast. She said, "Tell his attorney we're aligned on an efficient timeline." But here's what Marcus didn't know: the divorce filing had a quiet addition. A protective provision, drafted carefully by Carolyn, buried within the standard asset disclosure language, that required both parties to maintain all existing business contracts and client relationships in their current state for 90 days post-filing. 90 days. Long enough for every one of Vivienne's seawalls to cure. Long enough for Gerald's information to find its way into the right hands. Long enough for everything Vivienne had built in silence to become permanent. Marcus signed the divorce papers on a Thursday afternoon, at a restaurant he had chosen, neutral territory, he said, with his attorney present and a glass of water untouched on the table in front of him. He read the filing once, quickly. He nodded at his attorney. He picked up the pen. He signed with a looping flourish. And then he looked at Vivienne, across 11 years of marriage, across $247,000 of extracted trust, across 4 years of quiet, patient calculation, and he laughed. Full and satisfied. The laugh of a man who believes he has already won. Vivienne looked at him. She thought about her father. She thought about the 2 children sleeping across town at her sister's house. She thought about a spreadsheet she'd opened on a Sunday night that had started everything. She did not smile. She said, "I'll be in touch." She picked up her bag and walked out. 24 hours later, the certified letter arrived at Marcus's attorney's office. And that's when the crying started. Marcus was still in the warm glow of what he considered a clean victory when his attorney called at 9:17 the next morning. The attorney's name was Philip, and Philip was not a man who called without reason. "Marcus," he said. "I need you to come to my office. Now." "What happened?" "I have a certified mailing from Carolyn Bates's office. I need you to read it with me before you make any decisions." Marcus drove to Philip's office in 20 minutes, still believing, at the deepest level, that whatever this was, it was manageable. Something had come up. Some asset he'd miscalculated. A negotiation over numbers. He sat down across from Philip and watched his attorney open a large envelope and lay 29 pages on the table between them. Philip did not speak. He simply let Marcus read. Marcus read the first page. Civil complaint, fraudulent transfer of marital and business assets, breach of fiduciary duty, financial conspiracy with third parties, filed Fulton County Superior Court. He turned to the second page. Then the third. Page 4 was a table. Clean columns. Dates, amounts, account numbers. Meridian Strategic Group. 17 transactions. $91,000. Marcus set the page down. Philip said, quietly, "Keep reading." Page 9 was the entity structure. The LLC. The 3-layer ownership chain. His name at the bottom. Page 14 was the travel card. The Nashville condo deposit. Tamara's name in a box on the left. Page 18 was the communications transcript. Once the divorce goes through and the asset review is triggered. His own words. His own timestamp. Page 22 was Gerald's affidavit. Gerald, the quiet methodical man from Greensboro, who had been watching Marcus for reasons of his own and who had now, in 12 carefully documented pages, provided everything Douglas Webb hadn't been able to reach. Marcus set down the final page. Philip said, "I have to advise you, Marcus, that this complaint, as written, is." "I know what it is," Marcus said. His voice was very quiet. Philip said, "Marcus, I need you to look at me." Philip said, "She knew. She knew before you signed." And that was the moment. Not when he read the pages. Not when he saw his name in the entity structure. Not even when he saw his own words, his own careful plan, printed in 12-point font on page 18. It was the moment he understood the sequence. She had known. She had sat across from him at that restaurant table and watched him read a simple, clean divorce filing, watched him feel like he was winning, and she had known. She had let him laugh. That's when Marcus Hargrove started to cry. Here is the thing that Vivienne never told anyone, not Carolyn, not her sister, not Douglas Webb, until much later. She had known about Meridian Strategic Group for 2 years before the divorce. Not everything. Not the full scope. Not the documented evidence. But she had known something was wrong long before the Sunday evening with the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was not where she discovered it. The spreadsheet was where she decided to act. She had sensed it 3 years into the investigation window, sensed it the way she had always sensed misalignment in a business deal, the way her body registered wrong before her mind could name it. A number that should have been one thing was another. A timeline that didn't add up. A meeting Marcus mentioned that, when she mapped it against his calendar, could not have happened when he said it did. She had catalogued these moments. Not with purpose, not initially. Just, noted them, the way you note a crack in a wall you're not yet ready to repair. But she had never confronted him. And here is why: confrontation, when the other person is calculating, does not produce truth. It produces performance. If she had confronted Marcus the moment she sensed the misalignment, he would have had time to rebuild. Time to cover. Time to restructure and reposition. He was good at that. She had watched him do it for years with other people: the smooth pivot, the reasonable explanation, the plausible story delivered with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed. She had watched him do it. She had admired it, early in their marriage, before she understood what it meant about who he was. So she waited. She waited until she had everything. Until the foundation was so complete that there was nothing left to cover. And then she handed him the pen. She had not acted out of anger. She had not acted out of hurt. She had acted with the precision of a woman who had learned, in 11 years of marriage to a man who underestimated her, exactly how to build something that could not be undone. But here is what changes the entire story. Here is the thing that, when Vivienne finally told me, made me sit absolutely still in my chair. Marcus was not the first. Vivienne had been married once before, briefly, in her late 20s, to a man named Robert who left after 2 years and whom she rarely discussed. The marriage had ended simply, she always said. They had grown apart. What she had never told anyone, what she had spent 2 decades carefully not thinking about, was that Robert had also taken money. Not as much. Not as organized. But the same architecture: patient, incremental, leveraged against trust. She had been targeted twice. Not because she was naive. Not because she was weak. But because she was exactly the opposite, because she was a woman of substance, of resources, of quietly enormous capability, and there are people in this world who view that kind of woman not as a person to love but as an asset to acquire. And here is the thing that broke something open in Vivienne when she finally, fully understood it: she had blamed herself, after Robert, for being too trusting. She had carried that as a personal failing. A gap in her judgment. And that self-blame had made her believe, when Marcus came along, curious, present, asking the right questions, that he was the correction. That he was proof that her judgment had grown. That she had finally chosen wisely. He had used her own hard-won wisdom against her. He had studied what a woman who had been hurt once would need to see. And he had become it. That is not naivety. That is predation. When Vivienne understood that, fully understood it, she said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. I stopped blaming myself the moment I understood that he had worked to earn my trust the way a thief cases a house. You don't blame a house for having good locks. You don't blame a house for having good locks. She was not a woman who had been fooled. She was a woman who had been hunted. And she had survived. And she had built. And everything after that was going to look different because of it. The civil settlement came 8 weeks after the complaint was filed. Marcus capitulated faster than Carolyn expected. The Gerald affidavit, combined with the communications transcript and the entity documentation, left very little room. Philip called Carolyn and said, with the particular weariness of an attorney who has spent 2 days explaining reality to a client who doesn't want to hear it, he wants to resolve this. The settlement covered the $91,000 from the business extraction, the $62,000 from the joint asset transfers, the Nashville condo deposit, all legal fees, and additional damages for the coordination with Raymond Solis, which, once documented and presented, had caused Vivienne's insurance carrier to flag 3 pending renewals, creating a business disruption that was both real and quantifiable. All of it documented. All of it clean. Raymond Solis, who had believed he was the beneficiary of Marcus's scheme, found himself instead the subject of a separate civil filing, which Carolyn filed on Vivienne's behalf the same week, alleging tortious interference with existing business contracts. Solis settled quietly and quickly, for an amount that Carolyn described only as satisfying. But here is what the settlement did not give back. It did not give back 11 years. It did not give back her father's pride on her wedding day, a pride based on a belief in a man who didn't exist. It did not give back the years that Elijah and Nadia spent in a house held together by a performance of marriage, years that had formed them in ways that Vivienne was still, quietly, trying to understand. It did not give back the 2 years she had spent doubting her own judgment, carrying the weight of a marriage she could feel failing and believing, on some level, that it was a problem she was supposed to be able to solve if she was just enough of something, enough patient, enough present, enough good. Those years were simply gone. Vivienne was clear-eyed about this. She did not perform recovery. She did not rush to announce that she was fine, that she was thriving, that everything happened for a reason. She said, there is a cost. There is always a cost. And pretending there isn't is a lie I'm not willing to tell. What she did have, what she had built, what could not be taken and had not been taken, was the company. Her clients, secured. Her contracts, renewed. Her reputation, intact. She had also, in the months that followed, done something she had never quite allowed herself to do before. She had called Robert. Not to revisit. Not to reopen anything. Just to have an honest conversation, finally, after 2 decades, about what had happened. Robert was remarried, living in Atlanta, had 2 kids. He was not a bad person. He had been, Vivienne decided after that conversation, a person who had made choices he could not fully explain even to himself. But hearing him say, simply and without excuse, I took what wasn't mine and I've never fully made peace with it, that did something for Vivienne. It released her from the idea that there was something about her that had invited it. She also did something she had been putting off for 3 years. She expanded the company. A 3rd distribution contract, the largest she'd ever held. 4 new hires. A new operational facility in Raleigh, her hometown, deliberately, pointedly, in the city where her mother had taught school for 30 years. She moved her office into the building the spring after the divorce was final. She sat at her desk on the first morning and looked out the window at a street she'd walked as a girl. And she thought, this is mine. All of this is mine. Not because someone gave it to me. Because I built it and I protected it and I didn't let anyone take it. And that's the truth that didn't just change her life, it revealed who she had always been. And here we are. At the end of a story that I genuinely hope, did something more than just entertain you. Because this story is not really about Marcus. Marcus is a cautionary figure. A man who mistook intelligence for wisdom and calculation for connection, and who will spend the rest of his life explaining himself to attorneys and himself. This story is about Vivienne. About what happens when a woman who has been underestimated, who has been hurt, who has been used, who has stood in the rubble of something she believed in, decides not to collapse. Decides to build. Now I want to hear from you, because your perspective matters to me and to every person who is watching this right now. Here is my first question. When Vivienne discovered what Marcus had done, before she filed, before she confronted him, during those 4 months of silence, she made a choice that not everyone would make. She chose patience over confrontation. She chose strategy over anger. What would you have done? Could you have sat across from someone who had stolen from you, who had laughed at you behind your back, who was planning your financial destruction, and kept your face still? Or would the truth have come out before the plan was ready? There's no wrong answer. But I want to know yours. Tell me in the comments. Here is my second question, and this one is going to divide the room. Marcus's attorney, in the final settlement meeting, asked Carolyn whether Vivienne would consider a confidential agreement, meaning, Marcus's name would not appear in any public record connected to the fraud findings. Carolyn brought it to Vivienne. Vivienne said no. She said, if he does this again to someone else, and there is a record that could have warned them, I am responsible for that woman too. Do you think she was right to refuse the confidentiality? Or do you think the $318,000 was enough, that she should have taken the quiet resolution and moved on? Comment your answer. I'll be reading every single one. My third question, and this one is personal, which moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it the laugh? Was it the $247,000? Was it the realization that Marcus had studied what a woman who'd been hurt once would need to see, and become it? Or was it something else? Something in the way Vivienne kept moving, kept building, kept her face still while the plan took shape. Tell me. Because the moments that hit different people differently, those moments reveal something true about all of us. And finally, I need you to hear this, because I mean it. If any part of Vivienne's story felt familiar, if you recognized something, in the distance, in the cheerfulness that never quite bent toward you, in the numbers that didn't sit right, please trust that recognition. Not to panic. Not to assume the worst. But to pay attention. You don't have to be naive to be deceived. You just have to trust someone who worked to earn it. The response to that is not less trust. The response is knowing the difference between someone who earns your trust and someone who performs it. Vivienne knows the difference now. I hope her story helps you know it too. If you thought this story was powerful, wait until you hear what's coming next. I have a story that is going to make you question everything you think you know about what people owe each other, and what it really means to start over when the starting is not your choice. You do not want to miss it. Subscribe now so it finds you the moment it drops. And for everyone who made it to the end of this story, thank you. I know your time is precious. I know you could be anywhere. The fact that you stayed tells me something about you. You're someone who values truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it costs something. That's exactly who I'm making these stories for. Until next time, take care of yourself. Take care of each other. And remember, you don't blame a house for having good locks. Subscribe for stories that stay with you long after they end.